Hello everyone and welcome to the second part of the DCS Channel Map. After figuratively lubing you up with some minor mangling of a couple of English place names, now it's time to take the name mangling to the Major League. I make absolutely no apologies whatsoever for the following mispronunciations of your much fought over places, the misgenderings of inanimate objects that will no doubt attract Tumblrite levels of ire, and reducing some of the greatest battles of the 20th century to a series of skirmishes determining who won access to your grandmother's poontangs. Welcome to my second look at the DCS Channel Map. This time we're covering northeastern France and a little teensy-weensy bit of Belgium. So, as you can see from Google Maps, in this video we'll be taking a look at the northeastern part of an area that's now known as Nord-Pas-de-Calais. In the map you see on screen, I've roughly outlined the edges of the detailed areas to the south and east, so the lines represent where those levels of high detail roughly end. The first place we're going to take a look at, because I've just fucking taken off from there, is Abbeville airfield. This started off its war service as an Allied airfield hosting Gloucester Gladiators and Hurricanes supporting the British Expeditionary Force in 1940. It was then subject to a compulsory purchase order by the Luftwaffe and began hosting Bf-110s, FW-190s and finally Bf-109s. During its German tenure, this airfield was upgraded to concrete and played an important part in the Battle of Britain. In a story that will be tediously familiar by the end of this video, it was taken back by the Poles in 1944, but unfortunately not before the Germans had sabotaged the fuck out of it. It was repaired by the Allies, but only intermittently used with the rapid advance of the war, eventually becoming a transit base for the US Army Air Force in the spring of 1945. To sum up, during the war it was pretty much passed around like your brother at a pride party. Just south and west of the airfield is the town of Abbeville itself. In World War I it was fairly close to the front lines and was the location of an Australian Army field hospital, which was no doubt full of Australian Army soldiers, whom no doubt thought the local ladies of the afternoon to make the most of their tradesmen's entrance when their grand vestibules had a visit from the painters. The outbreak of World War II saw the Abbeville massacre. The Belgians had rounded up a load of far-right and far-left agitators with whom they knew not what to do. They gave them to the French, who had a drink on the problem and arrived at a solution. It's not all good news though, as it certainly wasn't an intelligence-led operation. They also shot the bus driver who drove the prisoners there, a Canadian hockey coach and a senile old friar. The town was eventually liberated in 1944 by the Polish 1st Armoured Division. This must have been completely befuddling to the local ladies of the afternoon who were just starting to get to grips with German. Now they had to scratch that and learn to hawk their holes in Polish. Our next port of call is the site of one of the greatest oh bollocks moments of World War II. Did anybody ever hear that urban legend about the guy organising a surprise birthday party for his best friend, only for everybody to leap out and discover his best friend was banging his wife? I think the story ends with the guy murdering everybody at the party, his best friend, his wife and his whole family, and then he starts a 12 gauge as the police arrive. I think it's meant to be a cautionary tale about surprise birthday parties, banging your best friend's wife, or shotguns, perhaps all three. Well, the unmitigated fuck-up that was the raid on Dieppe in August 1942 was pretty much the World War II version of that party. Over 6,000 men landed along this coast. Nearly 5,000 of them were Canadian because their government, feeling they were missing out on the action from nearly 6,000 kilometres away, felt their soldiers needed something to do. Obviously the British and Americans kept any objections private. Royal Marines, British Army Commandos and a small contingent of US Army Rangers and French Commandos also took part. There were a number of factors that pushed this raid, and in the aftermath recriminations seemed to fly around like Prince Andrew trying to avoid the feds. Interestingly, no records were kept. I suppose that was the 40s equivalent of using Tor. It is known that Soviet Mario had been pushing the Allies to open a western beachhead for some time. It is also known that the RAF were pushing quite hard for this raid. Buoyed by their success in the Battle of Britain, they were getting a bit of a semi for this whole war thing, and yearned for one final decisive fisticuffs with Jerry. As you can probably guess, things didn't go according to plan. The RAF initially claimed victory, but as we know, World War II airkill claims read like a popular Twitch streamer discussing his sexual conquests, with some being made up, some only being finished off after everyone else has had to go, and most being too young and inexperienced to legally be there in the first place. The final score was the RAF lost 106 aircraft, some to accidents and anti-aircraft fire, while the Luftwaffe only lost 48. Perhaps the most interesting part of this raid was the part played by RAF Flight Sergeant and Radar Specialist Jack Nissenthal. Flight Sergeant Nissenthal's mission was entirely voluntary, and what's surprising is any fucker volunteered for the mission when one considers he had to enter a German radar station to gather information on tech. He didn't have to do this alone, he had a group of Canadian bodyguards, who were obviously present to protect him from the Germans, or kill him if he was in danger of falling into German hands. How they got him into a landing craft with those balls is astounding. Only Flight Sergeant Nissenthal and one of his Canadian protectors managed to get back to England after the raid. In spite of his undoubtable bravery, due to the secrecy of the mission, he received neither commendations nor medals afterwards. The only service that were more reticent about the raid were the Royal Navy. In fact, they were so reticent they refused to risk a capital ship on the raid. So instead they lost 33 landing craft and a destroyer. This caused some consternation among the other services as they felt they would have been less exposed with more naval firepower. The blame can't be laid at the feet of the Royal Navy though. As with all problems, there are no simple answers. Of the over 6,000 men who landed, around 3,600 were killed, wounded or captured. 93% of those were Canadians. It was an all singing and dancing shit show. What you see below the aircraft here are probably the highest peaks on the map. To say the French side of the map is as flat as a witch's tit would be an absolute understatement. This is not due to an oversight in development, it's just a geographical fact. This is the area of France which joins on to Belgium. Belgium, along with Luxembourg and the Netherlands, are known as the Low Countries, and therefore are not particularly popular destinations among the mountaineering fraternity. Our next point of interest is famous for one of the most daring air raids of World War II. The raid took place in February 1944 under less than ideal weather conditions, i.e. cloudy and pissing snow. The purpose of the raid was to allow the escape of French resistance prisoners scheduled for a 12-gun German salute. The plan was to attack the guardhouse at noon while the guards were taking lunch, blow a hole in the wall of the prison and facilitate a mass escape. Another element attacked the railhead to slow the arrival of reinforcements. The mosquitoes crossed the channel at an altitude of about 10 metres and proceeded up the Somme Valley at treetop level while their escorts flew just below the cloud ceiling to engage any fighters sent to intercept. This was a morale booster as it presented the opportunity to save lives rather than take them. 258 prisoners managed to escape, although quite a number were later recaptured. Some German guards were killed along with 102 prisoners. Group Captain Picard, no not that one, and Flight Lieutenant Broadley were killed when the tail of their Mosquito was shot off. The prison was located along this road heading off to the northeast of the city. It's currently not here, but I suspect it will appear as development matures. Group Captain Picard and Flight Lieutenant Broadley were buried in the old World War I cemetery, which was just a few hundred metres beyond the prison. And you fuckers whinge about having to do startup again when you get shot down. This story has an interesting postscriptum. When the RAF investigated the circumstances of the raid after the war, they discovered that the resistance, far from requesting the raid, had only become aware of it when detailed information about the prison was requested by the British. It seems that MI6 were the main movers behind the raid, as the head of the French section of the Special Operations Executive said they had neither requested the raid nor knew who had. The SOE was the main organisation responsible for working behind enemy lines and were the liaison channel to the resistance. In typical MOD fashion, the documents relating to the request and whom it was ordered by are still sealed. It has been suggested that this raid was part of a diversionary tactic to make the Germans concentrate their defences on Calais prior to D-Day. But this seems really unlikely when one considers an almost 4-month gap and the fact that the raid went ahead in very inclement weather. I mean, if this was meant as a distraction for the Germans, they must have been suffering from the absolute antithesis of ADHD, whatever the fuck that may be. Oh, and before you all ask, the city is called Amiens. Our next point of interest is a city which gives its name to the British football chant, "Does she take it up the..." During the Battle of France in 1940, Arras and the surrounding area was traded back and forth like your dad in prison, until eventually the Allies had their Arras handed to them. Well, taken from them to be more precise. During the 1940 Battle of France, there was fierce fighting in the area involving Luftwaffe support. The Germans eventually took the town and held it for 4 years. The British finally liberated the area in 1944 to the absolute delight of the local muffmongers who were relieved not to have to learn Polish like the vag vendors of Abbeville. Our next destination is the second of the 4 currently available airfields on the French side of the map. Merville-Cologne was built by the French in 1936, probably in anticipation of German requirements for the upcoming war. It began use in 1937 and was taken over by the RAF during the Battle of France. It fell to the Germans in 1940 and was improved to 3 concrete runways. It sometimes seems like World War II was just an overzealous attempt on the part of the Germans to teach the natives how to build proper runways. It seems to have fallen out of use between 41 and 43. The last occupants were two Gruppe Jägerschwader II who moved to Silesia on November 17th. Which year is a fucking mystery, but if I were to place a bet, I would say 43, as they only seem to have arrived there in November 42, and we can all agree that wouldn't have given them enough time to sample the local wine, cheese, and a special dish sold by the local faux fun floggers called la moule. Mangez la moule, léchez la moule, niquez la moule. As even the most casual student of history or anyone observant enough to notice there's not a big black and red fucking flag hanging from their local post office will have deducted, the airfield was eventually recaptured by the Allies and had to be repaired, as apparently German runway altruism was not without limits. Our next stop on this Things You Never Wanted to Know About France tour is Calais. The war's arrival at Calais was less than auspicious. The siege of Calais, right in the middle of the Battle of France, was a serious kick in the testes for the Allies. 3,500 British and around 16,000 Dutch, Belgian and French prisoners of war were taken. The battle on the ground and in the air was fiercely contested. In the air, Hurricanes and Spitfires squared off against Bf-109s, 110s and Stukas. The town of course fell, and like your mother the day she met the football team, it was fucking ruined. The Germans moved in, turned the port into a command centre. This of course meant that with so many officers present, the price of poontang rose beyond the means of the common soldier. During the D-Day landings in 1944, Calais was used as a ruse to distract the Germans. I realise when I say ruse it makes it sound all rather genteel. What I mean by ruse is they basically fucking pounded the place. But I'm sure the natives were probably happier knowing they were being bombed by their friends for a change. The town was eventually liberated by the Canadians in September 1944, but it doesn't end there. There is one hilarious turn of events. The British conducted a bombing raid there at the end of February 1945, mistaking it for Dunkirk, which was still in German hands. Below to our left is the charming little airfield of Saint-Omer. This is the site of a meeting between two absolute legends from both sides of the air war. My favourite Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland and sweary legless RAF ace Douglas Bader. Bader was being treated at the Luftwaffe hospital nearby after bailing out and leaving one of his artificial legs in the Spitfire cockpit. This was the beginning of a lifelong friendship, with Bader cheekily asking Galland if he could test out his aircraft by doing a quick circuit. This request was obviously denied, but Galland did arrange permission for the RAF to be given passage to drop a replacement artificial leg. A replacement leg was parachuted in, but apparently the Germans got a bit pissy when the bombers proceeded on to their target, which was Gosnay Power Station. Galland stated in a later interview that because the power station was obscured by cloud, on the return leg they bombed his airfield. This was doubly embarrassing because rotund junkie and Luftwaffe chief Göring had signed off on the mission himself. Within spitting distance of Saint-Omer is another place of interest. Built into a small forested hill, it's called the Blockhouse. This was a bunker which was built to assemble and launch V-2 rockets. It never quite got off the ground because the Allies blew the bollocks out of it during Operation Crossbow. Currently there are just some placeholder buildings where the blockhouse should stand, but I'm sure over time it will fully develop. Lille is a city almost in conurbation with Roubaix and Tourcoing. It and the surrounding areas were attacked early during the Battle of France. The Germans began by bombing the railway lines in the suburbs of Lille. As Wehrmacht armoured infantry crossed the Belgian border, French and British troops withdrew, leaving around 1,000 Senegalese soldiers defending the citadel. They were fairly ill-equipped to say the least and managed to hold out for 4 days, which is amazing considering they were over 4,500 kilometres from home. In hindsight, they should have hauled out of there en masse saying, "Hey Francois, those fuckers look like they're going to treat us even worse than you do, and this shit looks well beyond our current material resources and remuneration package." Predictably, Senegalese prisoners of war weren't given the 5-star POW package by the Germans. It was probably closer to their barbarous 1-star civilian package. Of course, at the end of the war, the French government refused to pay their salaries for their time as POWs, so their service was rewarded with a shit sandwich at the beginning of the war, followed by a glass of cold spunk at the end. During the war, the Allies didn't rain too much death upon the city. They generally focused on the railway works and metalwork factories. Lille was liberated on September 2nd, 1944 by a combination of Free French forces backed by British armour. This map isn't all just about England and France. Belgium, like a lady of the afternoon, raises her petticoats just enough to give us a little sniff of what lies beyond. Just below here on the river is Courtrai. Courtrai was the fallback position for Belgian and Allied troops in May 1940. A counterattack was mounted, but the strategy ultimately failed. The Belgian forces were cut off from their allies, were suffering from low morale anyway, and were eventually forced to surrender, much to the ire of their allies. Life under the Reich in Courtrai was particularly shit, with the standard fare being a mixture of German repression, which although less severe than in France was still significant, and Allied bombing, as Courtrai was an important rail transit hub. By the time Courtrai was retaken by the Allies in September 1944, the centre of the city looked pretty much like the inside of Alexei Titano's rectum subsequent to his debut video. Coming up on the right is Dunkirk Mardyke Airfield. It looks improbably small like Onision's cock, so I'm going to try land there at the end of the video. Dunkirk is probably most famous for the greatest Allied evacuation of World War II. Although the real heroes were the Royal Navy, the civilian sailors who crossed the channel in everything from fishing trawlers to bathtubs, and of course the French soldiers who formed a rear guard to allow the British to withdraw. That sounds way more suggestive than intended. However, perhaps the escape of more than 1/3 men owes more to the overconfidence of one man than any of the former. Realising the British Expeditionary Force were encircled, the shouty Chaplin impersonator sat down with his generals to plot their demise. But before anyone could say Schnickelgruber, one fat junkie stepped forward and initiated one of the first hold my beer or hold my syringe moments of World War II. In true junkie fashion, ignoring all the facts, he spun a fantastical yarn. But this junkie didn't need 50p to take a bus to see his blind dying mother. This junkie had an air force to take him there. His name was Hermann Göring, and he was going to use his air force to destroy the BEF. Of course, he never consulted the Luftwaffe commanders on the state of their air crews. They had just fought their way through 4 countries. Well, in fairness, Luxembourg was probably taken with some harsh language. The predictable response would have been, "Zer fucked Herr Reichsmarschall. We need 2 more weeks." Completely exhausted air crews and the addition of low-hanging clouds scuppered any chances of a sustained attack from the air. Eventually an uncoded message was transmitted to send in the ground forces, which was not acted upon for several hours. Historians still differ to this day as to the reasons behind this. Were the Wehrmacht giving Hermann the finger? Was the OKW subtly giving Herr Heinkel the finger? But from an Allied perspective and an historic perspective, this was probably the most fortuitous moment of World War II. Before we wrap up, there are just a few more areas worthy of mention. The first of these is just below our nose. It's called Ostend. It's one of the major Belgian ports, and it's also a gateway via canal to the city of Bruges. It's just a blank space at the moment, but I'm sure as development progresses it will appear, as it is of some importance. Just a few clicks down the coast is the Belgian port of Zeebrugge, which always brings a snigger to my juvenile mind, as it makes me think of a German trying to be homophobic. Like Ostend, it's not yet developed, but both ports were sometimes used as U-boat resupply bases, and so were heavily attacked by the Allies. So if you like your fun, long, hard and full of seamen, then I'm sure the ports will appear later in development. With most of the Allied bombing in the area targeting the aforementioned nearby ports, Bruges was left largely untouched, like Ghislaine Maxwell's Book of Condolences. Oh, not yet? It's okay, I'll edit that bit out later. At the moment, parts of Bruges are a little bit of a cut and paste, but I'm sure as development progresses, more historic landmarks will be added. Now, as we make our way back towards Dunkirk Mardyke Airfield, it's time to wrap up the video. In the previous video, I mentioned some airfields that I think are going to appear on the English side as development progresses. This time I'm going to make a few guesses as to potential airfields that may appear on the French side, or German side as it were. As I said at the outset of the video, I'm now going to mangle some place names. If you live near any of those places, I'm sorry. Not for mangling the place names. I couldn't give 2 squirts of frozen jizz about that. I'm just sorry you have to live there. Maybe as your circumstances improve, you can afford to live in a better place. So my bet for the most likely airfields to be added on the French side are Calais-Marc, Méneslez, Audenberg, Fiennes and Glisy. I don't have any insider knowledge, this is just the idlest of speculation, but they seem most likely to me. I think this is the World War II map that Eagle Dynamics always wanted to make. Think about the scope of this map. With earlier sets of aircraft you can recreate the Battle of France, Battle of Britain, numerous adventures and misadventures in between, and finally the liberation of France. Perhaps I'm projecting my own feelings about this map onto Eagle Dynamics, but for me, this is the most versatile of the Western Theatre World War II maps. For many of you, it's going to be about retracing the steps taken by the pilots on both sides of the most hallowed legends of the air war. The tension, the elation, the frustration, the drama, the fear of being shot down, and the relief of finally reaching the other side of the channel knowing that a warm pint of Burton's was waiting for you. And maybe afterwards a quick Swedish trumpeting session on your grandmother's upper deck.